Strait of Hormuz, 1:47 p.m. The world's most dangerous choke point was about to boil over in a storm of steel. The USS Abraham Lincoln, a 100,000-ton symbol of American power, was transiting the narrow waters toward the Arabian Sea. Suddenly, 30 high-speed silhouettes emerged from the heat haze of the Iranian coastline, moving in a tight, coordinated swarm. These were the Revolutionary Guard's fast attack craft, specialized in asymmetric harassment and high-speed maritime maneuvers. The calm of the morning was shattered as the swarm began to close the gap at nearly 40 knots. The Lincoln's escort group, including the destroyer USS Halsey and the cruiser USS Mobile Bay, shifted into a defensive screen. Radar operators reported the 30 contacts were moving into a deliberate encirclement pattern, effectively cutting off the carrier's path. This wasn't a routine patrol or a simple demonstration of presence. This was a premeditated tactical surrounding of a superpower. The Iranian boats began to weave in and out of the shipping lanes, forcing nearby commercial tankers to veer away. On the bridge of the Lincoln, Admiral Richardson watched the red icons on the tactical display grow tighter and more aggressive. At 1:52 p.m., the bridge-to-bridge radio crackled with the first of many formal warnings from the American escort screen. Iranian small craft, this is United States Navy warship. You are approaching a sovereign vessel in international waters. Alter your course immediately and maintain a safe distance of 1,000 yards or face immediate defensive measures. The message was repeated in both English and Farsi, broadcasted over the emergency channel 16 for the entire world to hear. There was no response from the 30 boats, only the roar of their high-performance engines as they drew dangerously closer. The Iranian boats ignored the warning, instead tightening their circle around the Lincoln's massive and seemingly vulnerable gray hull. They were now within 500 yards, performing high-speed S-turns that forced the American destroyers to adjust their heading. This level of proximity was a direct violation of maritime safety protocols and a clear sign of escalating hostile intent. For every second they remained in this formation, the risk of a collision or a sudden violent escalation grew exponentially. The American sailors at their deck-mounted weapon stations watched the massed crews on the boats with steady, disciplined eyes. A second, more stern warning was issued at 1:58 p.m. as the Lincoln siren sounded a deep, rhythmic blast. Iranian craft, your actions are being interpreted as hostile. Discontinue your approach, or you will be fired upon immediately. The IRGC boats responded not with words, but by unmasking their weaponry, revealing a lethal array of heavy equipment. They began to train heavy machine guns and 170mm rocket launchers directly at the carrier's flight deck and bridge. This was the moment the situation transitioned from a maritime harassment to a direct existential threat to the sailors. Intelligence officers on the Lincoln utilized high-resolution optics to identify the specific armaments on the fast attack craft. They confirmed the presence of Italian-made anti-ship missiles and improvised explosive devices strapped to the forward hulls of the boats. These were not just patrol boats, they were suicide platforms and missile launchers capable of inflicting catastrophic damage on a ship. The presence of these heavy weapons in such close proximity meant the US Navy was now in a critical defensive window. The decision to engage was no longer a question of if, but a strategic calculation of the most effective and total way. The danger extended beyond the American fleet to the civilian container ships trapped in the chaos of the narrow strait. The Iranian swarm was using these merchant vessels as human shields, hiding behind their massive hulls to avoid clear shots. This reckless behavior proved that the Revolutionary Guard had no regard for international law or the lives of innocent mariners. The global economy's primary artery was being held hostage by 30 fiberglass boats and a fanatical Iranian chain of command. The Lincoln's Combat Information Center began the process of targeting and allocation, locking onto every single threat. At 2:03 p.m. the final warning was transmitted, but this time it was not a request. It was a final advisory. You have been warned multiple times to stand down. Your presence is an immediate threat to our safety and trade. The Iranian lead boat surged forward, crossing the 300-yard mark and aiming its bow at the Lincoln's midsection. On the carrier's deck, the order was given to clear the area as the defensive weapon systems began their automated spool-up. The tension in the air was so thick, it was palpable to every sailor standing watch in the sweltering heat. Admiral Richardson reviewed the rules of engagement one last time before authorizing the asymmetrical response protocol to be executed. He knew that a proportional response might lead to a prolonged skirmish that the Iranians could easily use for propaganda. To protect his sailors, the answer had to be absolute, sudden, and so overwhelming that it left no room for doubt. The goal was to remove the threat entirely, while leaving only a few survivors to bear witness to the consequences. The American giant was finished talking, and the era of restraint was ending in the blue waters of the Hormuz. The first miscalculation by the IRGC was the belief that the Lincoln would rely only on its visible deck guns. While the 50 caliber crews stayed ready, the real response was being coordinated from the air and the sea floor. Two AH-1Z Viper attack helicopters, already loitering in the shadows of the carrier's hangar, lifted off into the bright sky. Simultaneously, a flight of 4 FA-18 Super Hornets banked toward the strait, their targeting pods locked onto the Iranian swarm. The asymmetrical nature of the American response meant hitting the boats from angles they couldn't even monitor or defend. The engagement began with a precision that was as surgical as it was devastating for the Iranian fast boat crews. The Super Hornets released a salvo of small-diameter bombs, guided by GPS and laser designation from the carrier's primary sensors. Instead of a spray of bullets, the Iranian boats were hit by individual high-explosive munitions that vaporized their engines. 5 boats disappeared in the first 10 seconds, turned into clouds of fiberglass splinters and burning black fuel. The remaining 25 boats attempted to scatter, but the American net had already been cast wide and lethal. The Viper helicopters dived from the clouds, their 20mm cannons and Hellfire missiles engaging the boats with robotic accuracy. The Iranian crews tried to fire their shoulder-mounted manpads, but they couldn't get a lock on the fast-moving air assets. Every time a boat tried to maneuver into a firing position, it was met by a precision-guided munition from above. The invincible swarm was being systematically dismantled by an enemy they couldn't touch or even see clearly in the sky. The water of the strait was now a graveyard of burning oil and the remnants of the decimated IRGC fleet. On the bridge of the Lincoln, the tactical officers monitored the kill list as the number of active threats plummeted. The Iranian lead boat, which had been the most aggressive, was struck by a Hellfire missile detonating its own rockets. The resulting explosion was so massive, it created a temporary wake that rocked the nearby innocent civilian tankers. The message was clear. The American Navy would no longer tolerate the harassment of its sailors or the disruption of trade. The asymmetrical response was achieving its goal of total tactical dominance in a matter of a few minutes. The remaining Iranian boats, realizing the carnage was absolute, attempted to flee toward the safety of the rocky coastline. They abandoned their formation, leaving their comrades in the water as they pushed their engines to the absolute mechanical limit. But the American Vipers followed them, maintaining a lock-and-track profile to ensure the message was fully delivered. The swarm that had entered the water with such arrogance was now a disorganized group of survivors running away. The era of maritime coercion in the Strait of Hormuz was facing a final, fiery and inevitable reckoning. The final count of the first phase of the engagement confirmed that 15 Iranian boats had already been destroyed. The Lincoln remained unharmed, its massive hull moving steadily through the debris-strewn waters of the narrow Persian Gulf. The first half of the battle was a demonstration of why the asymmetrical answer is the most feared outcome. The transition from the defensive standoff to the total offensive was complete, but the final lesson was still being written. The world was watching the most lopsided naval engagement in the history of the modern Middle East. The assault continued without hesitation as the American strike group maximized its overwhelming technological and tactical advantage. The USS Halsey activated its Mk-38 25mm machine gun systems, tracking the fleeing boats with advanced thermal optics. Each burst of fire was calculated to disable the steering and munitions of the fast craft before they could fire back. The Iranian crews found themselves trapped in a kill zone where every maneuver was anticipated by American Aegis logic. The strait was no longer a theater of intimidation, but a demonstration of industrial-scale military efficiency and power. The precision of the American response ensured that the heavy weaponry on the Iranian boats was neutralized before use. Rocket launchers and machine gun nests were targeted individually, detonating the ammunition before it could be aimed at the fleet. This was the core of the asymmetrical strategy, to remove the enemy's ability to fight back before they realized they were lost. The Iranian boats despite their speed, were no match for the integrated sensor-to-shooter network of the US Navy. The water was cluttered with the sinking remains of what the Revolutionary Guard called their unstoppable navy. At 2:12 p.m., the tactical display on the Lincoln showed that 5 more Iranian boats had been neutralized. These craft had attempted to hide behind a slow-moving civilian tanker, using the innocent vessel as a shield. The American Viper pilots utilized top-down targeting, striking the boats with surgical precision that left the tanker unharmed. The debris of the 20th boat floated past the tanker's hull, a grim reminder of the cost of maritime aggression. The Iranian commanders on the mainland watched their screens go dark as their naval assets were systematically erased. The intensity of the American fire caused the final group of Iranian boats to break into even smaller, isolated groups. They were no longer operating as a swarm, but as panicked individuals trying to navigate a sea of high-explosive fire. The heavy equipment they carried, which had once represented a danger to the sailors, was now an anchor dragging them down. The American destroyers moved closer, their cannons providing a wall of steel that blocked any path of retreat. The efficiency of the Operation Iron Gate was proving that no small craft could survive a direct challenge to a carrier. By 2:18 p.m., the engagement had reached its pre-calculated conclusion as the 25th Iranian boat slipped beneath the waves. The water of the Hormuz was now cluttered with the wreckage of what was once a formidable and threatening swarm. The heavy machine guns and rocket launchers that had threatened American lives were now sinking toward the dark sea floor. The asymmetrical response had achieved its goal with 0 damage to American ships or civilian maritime traffic. The 25 boats had been erased in a storm of fire that lasted less than 30 minutes from the first shot. The decision was then made by the American command to leave the final 5 boats intact and afloat. These vessels were the survivors of a 30-boat force that had expected to humiliate the United States Navy. They were left adrift, their weapon systems destroyed, but their hulls intact enough to return to their home ports. This was a deliberate strategic choice to ensure that the reality of the battle was reported back to the IRGC leadership. The message was not just delivered by the fire, but by the witnesses who would live to tell the story. The ceasefire order was issued by Admiral Richardson, and the American air assets began their return to the carrier. The FA-18 Super Hornets banked away, their mission of tactical erasure complete and their target list cleared. The Viper helicopters hovered for a final moment, observing the 5 remaining boats as they sat motionless in the water. The silence that returned to the Strait of Hormuz was deafening, broken only by the sound of the Lincoln's engines. The asymmetrical answer had been given, and the question of who controlled the strait was answered in full. At 2:25 p.m., Admiral Richardson issued a final transmission to the survivors and any listening Iranian coastal stations. This is the United States Navy. We have demonstrated the consequences of putting American lives and global trade at risk. You were warned. You chose escalation. Let this be a permanent reminder that our resolve is absolute and our power total. The message was a cold conclusion to a battle that the Iranians had started with arrogance and ended in defeat. The 5 boats began their slow, humiliated crawl back toward the Iranian coast, leaving their comrades behind. The strategic impact of the engagement was felt immediately in the global capitals and the maritime insurance markets. The 30-minute battle had proven that the Iranian swarm tactic was obsolete when faced with an integrated American response. The news of 25 boats sunk in under half an hour sent a wave of shock through the regional military commands. It was a reminder that the US Navy does not negotiate with maritime blockades or tactical intimidation in international waters. The Lincoln's transit continued, its massive grey silhouette becoming a symbol of restored freedom of navigation. The survivors of the swarm reached the Iranian coastline, where they were met by a stunned and silent guard. They carried with them the story of how 30 boats were reduced to 5 in a matter of terrifying high-tech minutes. The history of the asymmetrical response would be spread through the IRGC, serving as a warning for future operations. No soldier, no sailor, and no pilot on the American side had been injured during the entire duration of the fight. The gamble of using heavy equipment to threaten the Lincoln had failed in the most spectacular and public way. The international community responded with a mixture of awe and relief as the trade routes remained open. Shipping companies that had considered rerouting their vessels resumed their normal paths through the vital Strait of Hormuz. The American giant had proven that it could protect the arterial road of the global economy with surgical precision. The asymmetrical response was not just a military victory, it was a stabilizer for a world dependent on the sea. The lessons of the day were being written into the naval doctrines of every superpower watching the Gulf. At 2:35 p.m., the USS Abraham Lincoln resumed its steady course toward the open waters of the Arabian Sea. The escort ships returned to their standard patrol formations, their weapon systems remaining in a state of high readiness. The debris of the 25 boats was already being dispersed by the strong, deep currents of the narrow strait. The commercial tankers that had been trapped in the crossfire began to resume their vital journeys across the world. The American giant had finished its work, and the arterial road of the global economy was once novamente aberta. The moral of the engagement was clear to any who would dare to test the patience of the United States. You can surround a carrier, you can train your weapons, and you can refuse to stand down. But you cannot expect to survive the asymmetrical answer that follows when the warnings are ignored. The 25 sunken boats were a physical record of a tactical mistake that cost the IRGC its naval pride. The story of the 30 boats would be told for generations as the day the swarm met the storm. The Abraham Lincoln continued its transit, a silent sentinel of a world that refuses to be intimidated by swarms. The Strait of Hormuz remained open, its vital waters cleared of the threat that had tried to close it. The memory of the 25 boats would serve as a permanent warning to any who would test the resolve. Freedom of navigation is not a gift, but a right defended by those willing to answer with asymmetrical force. The giant sailed on, the fire had died down, and the lessons of the day were finally and legally written. Strait of Hormuz, 2:45 p.m. The engagement was over, and the regional balance of power was restored. The Lincoln and its strike group had moved beyond the horizon, but their presence was still felt in every port. 30 boats launched, 25 sank, and 5 lived to tell the world why it happened. The asymmetrical answer was the final word in a conversation that Iran had started and America had ended. The strait was quiet once more, a blue highway for the world guarded by the ghosts of the fallen swarm.